On and off the water, when it comes to safety, there is no compromise. So always read and follow all manufacturers' guidelines. Today we're working in the cabin of my 21-foot trophy. We finally made it to the glassing stage and materials have arrived. When it came time to put my money on the line, I had to go with Gelcoat over paint. I've chosen this general purpose unwaxed laminating polyester resin, catalyzed with MEKP. There are glass bubbles for fairing, chop strand and mini fibers for structural putty, and Cabosil for thickening. Unwaxed gel coat for laminating and waxed gel coat for the curing layer. There's an assortment of mixing containers, chip brushes, solvent-resistant sleeves, and rollers. I have plastic spatulas, a laminating roller, and 2 sizes of aluminum fin rollers. I have 16 yards each of 1.5 ounce chop strand mat and 1708, and I was surprised by how heavy the rolls were. I plan to tear the CSM by hand so that the edges will interlace for optimum strength, but I've yet to decide how I will cut the 1708. I'll be catalyzing between 1 and 2% by volume, depending on the ambient temperature, and curing the final layer using waxed gel coat. For structural putty and fillets, I'll make classic peanut butter using Cabosil and chop strand fibers. And for fairing, it'll be glass bubbles and Cabosil. Glass bubbles make sanding easier and the Cabosil thickens to make a workable fairing putty. And the wax gel coat will allow the laminating resins to cure properly. In the non-skid process, I'll use laminating gel coat for the base and particle layers and waxed for the final layer, as I won't be able to sand once the rubber particles are suspended in the gel coat. With tools and materials, it's time to look at the test shelf and locker lids. These are the lids to the storage lockers hidden under the cushions in the cabin benches. They were painted and covered with headliner carpet, so I have to sand them down to bare wood. This is 60 grit paper on the dual action sander, removing paint from plywood. Compared to the direct drive setting, oscillating mode is designed for finishing, and it has more power than a regular orbital sander. But sections with thicker paint were a little difficult, resulting in over-sanding in the surrounding softer areas. So I try to sand evenly without tearing big holes in the wood. A layer of fiberglass and some gel coat will greatly improve these locker lids. But for now, the lids will have to wait until the benches have been fully restored. This is the forward shelf inside the cabin. It will be my first test using polyester resin, CSM, and 1708 biaxial cloth. The top gets 1 layer of CSM and 1 layer of 1708, fairing and sanding. This lip is the front edge of the shelf, so it will be my first radius using peanut butter. The mini belt sander is extremely helpful, but it looks like I'll have to do a bit of hand sanding. And this is a classic spot for air pockets and voids, so a good radius will be essential within the project. And this is where the shelf sits inside the cabin. I have chosen not to glass the shelf in place to keep it removable. So I'm going to start with the radius and wrapping the lip with chop strand. Now that I'm working with resins and vapors, I need a respirator filter that protects against organic compounds. The charcoal filter constantly absorbs the air around it, so I keep it in this Ziploc bag to extend the life of the expensive filter. And all of the filler compounds are easily airborne and very toxic, so a respirator is mandatory when using these products. I'm using unwaxed polyester resin so that I don't have to sand between layers, but pouring from a full pail is going to take some practice. I'm adding the chop strand before the catalyst to ensure the strands are fully mixed and to give free mixing time. I'm now working carefully to avoid getting any particles airborne as I'm working in my garage. There's no specific ratio of fiber to resin, but I can see a lot of clear gel, so I keep adding more fibers. Once the fibers are well mixed, we can catalyze, and the clock starts ticking now. At this temperature, at 1%, the gel time is listed as 40 minutes. This is a good starting place considering I'm a novice. This looks pretty good for a test fillet. The fibers are well incorporated and it's ready for thickening. Cabasil is a silica powder that serves as a thickening agent, but it doesn't mix into the resin easily. It takes a lot of stirring to fully incorporate, and the particles are easily pushed into the air. I handle this stuff very carefully. Like that time I held a $2 million Emily car painting during a photo shoot. Here it is, my first attempt at peanut butter. It's the consistency of gel toothpaste. The surface is now dry, sanded with 60 grit, and cleaned with acetone. And despite an unstable work surface, it lays in pretty well. I'm using a large tongue depressor to apply the peanut butter. In retrospect, I should have wet out the surface with multiple coats of unwaxed resin before adding the fillet. This might be overkill for the lip of a shelf, but I needed to practice before I work on anything really important. My goal is to wrap the lip with chop strand and roll it into the radius before it sets. The piece is elevated on a milk crate, sitting on plastic, which is very slippery and clearly a dumb idea. I'm using unwaxed resin to wet out the wood. Time will tell if the 3 layers of resin I added prior to fabric will be sufficient, considering how dry this wood is. Which is specifically the advantage of using non-waxed resin. Clearly, I have to plan a lot better moving forward. I tore the chop strand mat by hand to allow the edges to feather more smoothly. And I work from the top down to keep the strands laying correctly. Like petting a cat against the grain, you don't want to pull the strands back against themselves. Because I was wrapping the underside of the shelf, I needed to keep it elevated, but this is a terrible way to work. It would slide on the plastic every time I touched it, But with catalyzed resin, I didn't want to lose it, so I kept working like a mad fool. But I keep at it, and the CSM lays down and wraps all the way around the lip. You can see that the fillets are very soft. I'll use more chopped fibers and cabasil the next time. The roller is easy to use and makes for a nice, firm radius. And despite the early mistakes, it looks pretty good for my first attempt. I have a lot to learn before I tackle the deck repair in the fuel tank project. But luckily, I'll get a lot of practice repairing the inside of the cabin. And I can see that this is going to be a major challenge for me. This is the top of the shelf with a layer of CSM and a layer of 1708 as a dry layup. Meaning I poured resin onto dry fabric and spread it with a yellow spreader. I rolled the air bubbles out with a fin roller and let it set. There are a few pockets of air bubbles in low spots that were created by the sander, which means that the surface has to be as perfect as possible before you apply any glass. Once the resin has set, it's time for wax gel coat. This layer will be sandable and will cure the laminating resin. I was amazed at how strong the gel coat fumes were and very happy with the respirator. And I continue to take all PPE precautions. Catalyzed at 1%, I mix well, brush it on, and call it a night. The next morning, I glass the underside of the shelf with a single upside down layer of 1708. I learned that you get a better result if the fabric extends past the edge and later trimmed, than it is to be short and require fairing along the edge. You can see how the left side doesn't cover and will require fairing, ultimately making a weaker corner. This is the underside of the shelf, without sanding, laid on with a chip brush. It is clearly rough and would benefit from even a quick taste of sandpaper. The cheap chip brush is just too rough for any finishing, but this coat is for curing and will be sanded. Next time, I'll use a small roller. This is an example of the least amount of work required to get a result. It's rough, like one would expect in an engine room or bilge. And you can see how the dimples are being filled with gel coat. This might be sufficient for a shelf or weatherproofing plywood, but sanding and a second layer would be much better. This is the top of the shelf sanded with 60 grit and a single coat of fairing. My first attempt at fairing putty didn't go so well. I didn't use enough glass bubbles, making it resin rich and hard to sand. And I underestimated the cabasil, and it performed a lot like drywall mud, thin and susceptible to trowel marks. And I used unwaxed resin, which would make hand sanding more difficult. I'm sanding the underside with 60 grit at medium speed on oscillating finishing mode. You can see how gel coat fills the matrix of dimples in the 1708. I had leftover gel coat when I painted this, so I made fairing compound using glass bubbles and cabasil and used it on the edges of the shelf. The 60 grit is great for shaping, setting the edge, knocking off sharp sticky bits, while providing a solid mechanical bond for subsequent layers. For rudimentary finishing, like inside the fuel tank area and this shelf, I should be comfortable with the results. I've sanded the single layer of fairing and prepared the finished coat. From here forward, every layer will be sanded and waxed. Before I apply the finishing layer, it's a good cleaning with acetone. And at these prices, it's liquid gold. I'm covering this 60 grit surface with waxed gel coat in a single finishing layer. Will 1 round of fairing and 2 rounds of sanding be acceptable inside the cabin? And is it something I can realistically accomplish? I want to see if a single finishing layer will be sufficient, so I'm generous with the material. It's a coating like an M&M, not a thin layer like paint. This small roller is the most cost-effective way for me to apply material, considering the sleeve cannot be cleaned, so every step costs me money. Luckily, my supplier sells these sleeves in boxes of 50. I assume this is what is referred to as orange peel, and I know it can be sanded and buffed to a beautiful shine. And these brush strokes are no good, so I'll need something better than chip brushes for finishing. But for the inside of a fishing boat, I'd be thrilled if it looks this good. But every step costs me money, and if I don't reduce the number of mistakes, things could get out of control.